Hey everyone, welcome back to Valley Chat. Pastor John Carolus here with a special guest today, Pastor Kurt Hellwig, a friend of mine from seminary days who is a pastor in Central Phoenix. Pastor Kurt, thank you for being with us today. If you don't mind sharing just a little bit about your church's story down there on, 7th and Camelbacks?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Pastor John. My name is Pastor Kurt Hellwig, and I serve Mount Calvary Lutheran Church here in Central Phoenix. So we're at 7th Avenue in Camelback. And Mount Calvary is, as far as we know, the oldest LCMS church in Central Arizona. So it's very much a part of our story. Now, Mount Calvary was first organized back in the 50s. It was kind of on the edge of town here at Camelback Road, believe it or not. It was mostly, palm orchards and orange orchards and just fields for miles and miles. But now it's a very different kind of setting, right? So we celebrate our 75th anniversary, and as the congregation has aged, the neighborhood has changed a lot too. So Mount Calvary was, started out, I think, sociologically speaking, like an era with churches where it's kind of like the field of dreams, right? If you build it, they will come, and that was very much the case. Mount Calvary was built, and then many families from areas of the country where the Lutheran Church is a lot more established. You move down into this area, and so the church was blessed with a lot of numerical growth. And with that, Mount Calvary planted a number of congregations around the valley, right? But then towards the kind of late '90s, early 2000s, the area started to change, and then there were kind of a series of changes in the area over the years, and the congregation, both for those reasons and for a variety of reasons, kind of dwindled really to the
Hmm.
point where I think after the pandemic, when I accepted the call here, on my first Sunday, we had about 12 people or we had exactly 12 people. Nice biblical number in church that Sunday, including my wife, myself, the visitation pastor, and the pianist. So, and the story since then has been one of faithfulness from God, and also one of modest growth as well. So, some things that have been, I guess you can say, kind of drivers for our revitalization to where we're at today, where probably like 120, 130 or so people worship in our facility every Sunday. Some big levers for that have been, college ministry due to our proximity to Grand Canyon, to ASU downtown, to recent graduates from those institutions in the area, and then also immigrant ministry as well. So, Mount Calvary is really making the turn, kind of pivot to serve the city of Phoenix that we see around us today.
Yeah,
So,
I feel like it's fascinating to hear about churches' histories because Shepherd is about 30 years behind Mount Calvary, and I'm sure in some way traces its roots pretty directly into that congregation. But when it was built, the campus on Shea and 96 was built kind of in the middle of nowhere in terms of 96 having been a dirt road and Shea Boulevard being a two-lane, paved road out toward Fountain Hills. And it was a church that people went and drove to worship at. And there still are plenty of people who travel a significant distance to worship at our church, and I'm sure at Mount Calvary as well, but it also becomes more reflective of the community that rises up around it. And so it sounds like with the college students and with the immigrant worship services that happen at Mount Calvary and the pastors that you are connected with in that community, also like there's that connection of, okay, the church was built there, and the people that built it and worshiped there may not have lived super close to it, but as the city rose up around it, now you actually are participating in worshiping alongside the people that are there. So tell us a little bit about kind of inner city or urban ministry. You're in a place where the valley is pretty much, you're right in the center of it, and a lot of people at Shepherd and in our community, we're kind of on the edge. So talk about urban ministry.
well, first of all, it's a great note hitting on um, the kind of the paradigm of ministry here in the valley in a lot of ways, right? There's sort of two central questions of how do we handle this relentless growth we see in the Phoenix metro area. And as I've gotten to know many of the brothers around the valley, including yourself, right, it is kind of a similar story of like church.
Mm-hmm.
We do a good job establishing churches on the edge. They boom and then they decline. How do we kind of break that cycle? And there's also the question, I think, of that we as kind of Lutherans in the Phoenix area have to broadly ask of how do we, you know, gather and make disciples from the people who are here now, um, and not rely on immigration from other parts of the United States, basically. So the immigration we see today is more international, right? Or it's coming from regions of the United States that maybe historically have been less Lutheranized, for lack of a let's find a word. So how do we reach those people now too? That's a big question. It kind of leads me into the conversation about urban ministry, right? Really since like the 1950s in this country, there's been something sociologists call like the big sort, right? So people are kind of moving and isolating, sorting, as the name suggests, with like-minded people. This goes kind of all directions across all kinds of people, all kinds of incomes, races, ideologies, etc. Right? And that's just simply not the case, I guess, in an urban center, right? Instead, you have people from all walks of life. You have people of many different ethnic backgrounds, many different types of beliefs, many different experiences, many different kind of income levels, right? And so you have all that really thrown together in a city center. And I think if you think of like Seventh Avenue and Camelback as kind of a grid, right? Like the area of the Northeast is very different than the area to the Southeast, which is very different than the area of the Southwest or the Northwest of that of those major corridors in our city. And so that's so the urban ministry, right? I think has to be um, constantly renewing and constantly kind of refining and defining itself to serve um, probably a broader net of people maybe than a other types of ministries. And then we also need to be constantly aware of change that happens in our neighborhoods because I think change happens at a much faster rate in a city center.
Yeah, I feel like that also is reflective of the Christian call to be adaptive toward the context that God puts us into. And so,
Yeah.
in that very specific setting where it's a congregation in an urban setting with significant transient sort of characteristics happening. A lot of people moving in and moving out, and economic factors playing a significant role when there's big shifts. And needing to be able to speak into the lives of the people who are around you, and also meeting them with the various needs that may arise. And the church really takes on that maybe sort of early church kind of method of care for one another in a little bit more of a tangible way. Whereas in more maybe established or less change oriented contexts and communities, the church still cares for one another, but the care isn't exactly the same. It's maybe a less tangible care, a little bit more kind of uh, less material sort of care, if that makes sense. And so it's amazing to hear the ways that your church is working to remain a faithful bastion of the gospel and the light of Christ in the community that's risen up around it and continues to move and live around it. And I think there's some interesting trends, right, happening in our country and happening in our city and in our valley when it comes to young people and religion, young people in church. There's a lot of headlines about Gen Z and a lot of feelings and perspectives on Gen Z, depending on what demographic maybe or generation, the person speaking comes from. Can
Yeah.
you speak a little bit into the Gen Z ministry experiences you've had at Mount Calvary, and also just some of the major insights across our country when it comes to Gen Z and faith?
Yeah, I mean, it's just delightful to work with younger people and with college students. So, we are the official LCMS campus ministry for ASU downtown, for Phoenix College, which is actually probably the closest higher ed institution to us, and then also to Grand Canyon University. And all of those are different, very different contexts and ministry fields in their own rights. Um, yeah, I mean, Gen Z, like you said, John, there's all kinds of headlines about that, right? So what is really, really going on? What really at its core is an openness to um, spiritual mystery that I think is kind of unique in the history of our country, and certainly unique even in our own lifetimes, right? As people, as I think both members of the kind of generation above, Gen Z, this is sort of a unique moment of honest searching by many young people for looking for something more in a lot of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. There's sort of I feel like as a millennial, right, there's a jadedness and maybe a closedness, and Gen Z seems to be a little bit more hopeful, a little more realistic, maybe, um, but also hopeful for themselves and hopeful for the world, and recognizing that spirituality and mystery are significant parts of reality.
Yeah.
And so I think it's amazing that you're in a position, you and your congregation are in a position to so readily speak into and meet the ministry needs of those of that generation. And I think too, something people don't realize about Phoenix, even if you live here, is just how many colleges there are. Even in sort of the central Phoenix area, there's a lot of higher education institutions, and each one of them, right, is kind of a collecting place for these young minds that are seeking to grow and establish themselves and understand who they are. And a church right there in the middle of it is such a wonderful resource for them to gather around and hear the word. Are there any particular students or stories that have just inspired you in your ministry to keep going and to keep digging into those connections?
Yeah, I think when I think of those we've kind of bumped into, right? A few stories come to mind. One young man who um basically did not really grow up in a faith context, grew up in a totally we say a kind of post-Christian environment. So like was not, even drugged to church on Christmas and Easter by his grandma kind of a thing. And then he ended up becoming a Christian like towards the end of high school, like through just like the ministry of another congregation in another state, right? And was here at Grand Canyon, started kind of digging a little bit deeper, right? And became interested in um, I would say Christian traditions that are more kind of open to the mystery and the history of the Christian faith. And so he was considering, like, do I, become Catholic, to become Eastern Orthodox, and then eventually settled on being Lutheran. And this, kind of also can be said of a number of other students that we encounter. Right, this is a very common story, right, of one of going from either like total non-belief through kind of the broad path in the best possible sense of American evangelicalism to a more like historic faith, right? So that's a very common story, right? And by the way, the young man I referenced before was confirmed at Mount Calvary this last year, and has an offer to attend Concordia Seminary to be a pastor, the institution both Pastor John and I graduated from, and uh, humbly and imperfectly served on the soccer pitch too. And so yeah, headline he wants to be pastor, and that's
Yeah.
fantastic.
Yeah,
Um,
praise God. What
so
a
that
what a great story. And I think that also will breathe life into people who
yeah,
maybe are easily our attention is so easily caught by the negative realities happening either in our church body or sort of across religion more broadly. Is that there is this hunger within the younger generation to find what's real and to push against some of the maybe more brittle and therefore fragile assumptions, cultural assumptions that have arisen in, the next couple of generations closest to them, which raises an interesting question. There's a lot of people in my congregation, I'm sure in your congregation as well, and just people who are connected into our church and preschool community who want to know how to how to witness to the younger members of their family or young people that they're connected to in their life, their child, their grandchild, their niece or nephew. How do you witness to someone maybe who is closer to you, and how do you share your faith with them when it can seem like such a challenging idea?
yeah, I think it kind of goes back to that idea of what they're looking for in the first place, right? Which is not all the answers, but a story they can relate to, right? I shared the kind of pattern we've seen of people coming from non-belief to Lutheran belief. There's also kind of a story of a lot of Lutheran kids that end up in the valley, one way or another, right? Maybe it's not even through college, right? Who all of a sudden realize, man, these dynamics of sin and grace that they always heard about are really real, and they need need God's grace in their life, and being able to connect with people of kind of like a similar age is helpful in that regard. So yeah, to your point, being like if somebody's listening to this and asking like, how do I talk to my son or daughter about faith? How do I talk to my grandkids about faith? I think it really starts with um, your own story, right, and what a
Mm.
difference faith has made to you.
Yeah.
That
Yeah. Some of the things I've read have talked about how, in the last 10 or 15 years, or maybe even 20 years, the methodology of youth ministry was find somebody that looked like, talked like, and kept up with the culture of the youth in your church or the youth you wanted in your church.
Yep.
And for someone to kind of try and keep up with the pace of trends online today would require, full-time attention and dedication to that if it's not just the world they live and breathe in. And so to send someone who's not a part of the generation into a ministry environment where they're having to put on this face of relevance, uh, Gen Z is able to actually just see right through that and say, I'm not after somebody that needs to look like me and talk to me. I want someone that's in touch with themselves and actually honest and authentic. And I can tell believes what they say they believe. And that would be, maybe my encouragement to people who ask the same question is like, as you mentioned, what is your story? How is your faith impacting your day to day life? And how can you just share the difference that it makes in your heart with someone who notices that there's something different about you?
Yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely true. And we don't need to have we don't need to have all the answers. I think so often we're kind of afraid of engaging in a conversation with people, and we wonder like, what are we going to, what if they ask a question that like stumps us, right? But that's really that's not often a chief concern, right? I think the chief concern is, does this person like care for me? Are they going to be there for me, like through the highs and the lows, right?
Yeah. And can they handle, do they have the integrity to say, I don't know? And I think so much of uh, recent modern, postmodern, popular American Christianity, which of course we're all a part of, has been, oh, I've got an answer to every question that can be raised, and all the difficulties of life fit into my system of spirituality,
Mhm.
and the mask on that falls off pretty quick when you start to realize that, oh, like there isn't actually an answer to all this stuff. And there is some complex and difficult things that there isn't some just clean quip answer to. And yet there still are authentic Christians who truly do find their peace and grace coming from Jesus. What does that mean? What does that look like? So, yeah, thank you, Pastor Kerr, for all your insight today and for sharing a little bit of the Mount Calvary story and exposing our own, mixed level of success playing graduate level soccer. And
Yeah.
it's always a pleasure talking to you, and always learn something when we have a conversation. So thanks for joining us, and thanks everyone for tuning in today. And if you've got questions about uh, urban ministry, about young people in the faith, or maybe you are ever in Central Phoenix or closer to that area, stop by Mount Calvary on Sundays and say hello. Pastor Kurt, what time are your services, and where can they find you online?
Oh, sure. So our URL is going to be mclcphx.org. And then our service time, we have two services, one in English and one in an East African language. The English service begins at 9:30 technically, but really this is maybe also the urban ministry distinction. It kind of begins when everyone's there. So often our service begins more at 9:35 or 9:40. But yeah, we'd love to have you. Um, and that's one thing. Even when it was just a handful of people, my wife and I were really blessed to experience the warmth and hospitality of the people here, including our older members who are our heroes for their steadfastness in the midst of all this change. Right? Because we talked a lot about change, the need to pivot, all these macro trends, but in the midst of that, there are all kinds of stories of faithfulness and grief in the midst of that faithfulness too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks again, Kurt, and thanks again for everyone tuning in. We'll talk to you next time.
Thanks, Pastor John.